Have you ever wondered what really happens the moment your heart stops beating the instant life as you know it fades away? Imagine your last breath not as an ending but as a doorway, opening to something mysterious, powerful, and utterly profound. Ancient masters have mapped this incredible journey, leaving us clues hidden for centuries in the legendary Tibetan Book of the Dead. Today, you're about to uncover secrets of what lies beyond that final heartbeat, a stunning realm filled with both luminous visions and daunting shadows, each reflecting the deepest truths within your own soul. What if knowing these secrets could transform how you live today, freeing you from fear and guiding you toward true inner peace? You're just moments away from a captivating journey that might change your perspective forever. Stick with me, because the ending is something you won't expect, and it's something you'll never forget. If this resonates with you, please subscribe to our channel to explore even more profound insights and transformative stories that speak directly to life's greatest mysteries. Imagine a single breath, leaving your body for the very last time, the gentle ebb of air receding from your lungs until there is simply no inhale left. In that singular moment, the form you have inhabited throughout the entirety of your life, the body that has accompanied you from the moment of birth, falls irreversibly silent. Yet contrary to our usual assumptions about mortality, the world does not collapse into infinite darkness in that instant. Consciousness does not flicker out like a candle deprived of oxygen. Instead, you are confronted with a curious sensation of weightlessness, a profound lightness that feels like you are being unburdened of the heaviness you've carried for as long as you can recall. At the very edge of life, something stirs that goes beyond a simple end to heartbeat and breath. In the next seconds, minutes, and perhaps hours after the final exhalation, awareness itself remains, even though the body lies inert. The world around you might appear distorted, as if viewed through a veil that stretches time or muffles sound. In many cultures, people talk about drifting through a tunnel of bright illumination or feeling themselves hover above their own physical forms. This transitional phase has sparked the curiosity of civilizations throughout history. Across different continents and traditions, it has often been described as the soul's ascension toward a divine light or a lingering presence doomed to wander aimlessly between this realm and the next. But underneath these myriad tales, there exists a particular ancient text revered by countless spiritual seekers, a book that purports to articulate step by meticulous step what unfolds for the consciousness after the heart's final beat. This text is called the Bardo Thodol, commonly referred to in the Western world as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. What makes this text striking is its approach. Rather than offering vague mythology or ungrounded superstition, it presents a comprehensive map, a kind of spiritual blueprint meant to guide the consciousness through the intermediate states that follow death. Within the pages of this mysterious and once hidden manuscript, the notion of physical death as an absolute ending is directly challenged. Instead, it frames the moment of death as an opening a passage to face illusions, a test of spiritual readiness, and a gateway that may lead to either liberation or to darker, more bewildering corridors of existence. Should the teachings of the Bardo Thodol be true, they suggest that death is only the beginning of a longer, far more intricate journey than most are prepared to comprehend. According to these Tibetan instructions, when we die, the mind enters a series of sequential experiences, gateways or bardos, where everything depends on our capacity to recognize and navigate illusions. Some individuals, it is said, possess the readiness to move beyond fear, beyond clinging to familiar forms, and to merge with the radiant light of pure awareness. Others, however, become entangled in their own projections, cast adrift by unresolved attachments, doubts, or unrecognized illusions. This is where the Bardo Thodol reveals its essential insight that the unfolding events after death are deeply intertwined with one's mental and emotional state in life. By understanding this text, by preparing for our final transition before it arrives, we place ourselves in the best position to awaken rather than be lost in the hall of mirrors that awaits beyond mortality's veil. And so the pressing question arises, if we are all destined to encounter death, how can we ensure that when that moment arrives, we are truly ready? This readiness alludes to something profoundly transformative, the capacity to face death not as a random or abrupt cessation, but as a journey that can be consciously steered. In the Tibetan tradition, the Bardo Thodol is often kept from casual readers, because of how powerful, and some might argue unsettling, its revelations can be. Rather than being a text for passive consumption, it is considered a ritual guide meant to be read aloud to individuals who have died or are on the brink of death. Through its instructions, the newly departed soul is guided step by careful step through visions, illusions, and possible pitfalls that manifest in the intermediate states following the body's demise. The fundamental premise is that these experiences are not external punishments or rewards, but reflections of the person's own mind and past actions. Delving into the historical roots of the Bardo Thodol takes us back more than a millennium to the era of Padmasambhava, also honored as Guru Rinpoche by Tibetan Buddhists. Viewed not merely as a teacher of Buddhism in Tibet, he was, according to legend, a master of esoteric wisdom and mystical prowess. He arrived in a land steeped in ancient shamanic beliefs and found that sharing the Dharma was not a straightforward matter of philosophical debate, but rather a profound contest of spiritual forces. Resistance to the new teachings was fierce. Some narratives claim that the very indigenous spirits of Tibet rose to challenge him, prompting him not to annihilate, but to integrate these entities into the broad tapestry of Buddhist practice. It was during this epical struggle that Padmasambhava is said to have composed or revealed the teachings contained in the Bardo Thodol. Fearing that society was not yet prepared for these deeply esoteric instructions, Padmasambhava hid the text within remote caves and sacred sites, essentially encoding them as terma, or hidden treasures. Monks and spiritual practitioners who were deemed ready would uncover these texts in future centuries, ensuring that their potent insights would surface only when consciousness and cultural openness had evolved sufficiently to handle them. Over many generations, the text remained obscure, passed along like a whispered secret among monastic circles. Eventually, the world at large rediscovered it, and the question inevitably arose, why has this knowledge re-emerged in more modern times? Was it purely coincidence, or was it meant to resurface as humanity's collective consciousness evolved? One of the most crucial teachings of the Bardo Thodol is that the interval following physical death is not necessarily a clean break with reality. Instead, there can be a window of lingering awareness spanning from mere seconds to several days, during which the departed mind still perceives sensations, hears voices and experiences, phenomena unmediated by a physical body. This particular stage is sometimes referred to as the Chikai Bardo, the transitional point where the soul recognizes that it is no longer confined to flesh and bone. Whether one interprets the phenomenon through a strictly religious lens or a more secular spiritual framework, the experience of near-death survivors appears to align remarkably with descriptions in the text. They recount tunnels of light, an intense sense of presence, a panoramic replay of personal memory, and a distinct sensation that time itself has either slowed or expanded. In that initial post-death phase, everything hinges upon recognition. The Bardo Thodol emphasizes that if an individual can remain calm and accept what is happening, acknowledging the clear light of pure consciousness, there is an unparalleled opportunity for liberation. In Tibetan Buddhism, this clear light is not an external deity or heaven. Rather, it is the unfiltered essence of mind, the fundamental luminosity, often obscured by everyday thoughts and attachments. If in the critical moments after dying the soul recognizes this light as inseparable from its own true nature, it may transcend the cycles of rebirth and join a state of ultimate awakening. However, this is no small feat, for our usual tendencies are to recoil from the unfamiliar or retreat into the known patterns we clung to in life. For most of us, fear or disorientation sets in the instant the comforting anchors of embodiment vanish. Attachments formed over a lifetime become a kind of mental gravity, pulling the newly freed consciousness back into states of confusion or cyclical re-involvement in samsara, the endless round of birth, suffering, and death. The Bardo Thodol spells out that the distinction between one who sees the light and one who recoils from it comes down to mental conditioning cultivated in life. If an individual has spent their time recognizing the impermanence of the phenomenal world and consistently trained in mindfulness and detachment, then the brilliant, all-encompassing clarity emerging after death might be neither frightening nor alien. Instead, it could be recognized as a homecoming, a return to the foundational state of pure awareness. Conversely, those who have avoided confronting mortality or relinquishing attachments often encounter illusions that carry them deeper into confusion. Some souls linger around their old haunts, their homes, or their loved ones, not fully aware that their corporeal existence has ended. Others slip into illusory paradises or horrifying scenes, all of which merely reflect their own unaddressed emotional and psychological patterns. The text uses the term bardo, literally an in-between state, to refer not just to what happens after death, but to any transitional phase where the usual reference points of the mind have fallen away, yet no new grounding has been found. Death is merely the most dramatic such transition, overshadowing our daily, subtler experiences of uncertainty. The intermediate realm, immediately after the body goes still, can thus feel like floating in a dreamlike world without boundaries. Freed from physical constraints, the mind conjures illusions that can be breathtakingly beautiful or unspeakably terrifying, depending on deeply ingrained habits of thought and emotion. No matter which illusions emerge, however, the fundamental teaching remains unwavering. If you recognize that these appearances come from your own consciousness, you can transform the experience entirely. Yet, if you believe these illusions to be real, you become ensnared by them, leading to another cycle of rebirth. This dynamic is why Tibetan monasteries place great emphasis on meditation and training in recognizing the nature of one's own mind well before death. Such preparation instills a deeper capacity to see beyond illusions and helps calm the mind even when the body disintegrates. In recounting how souls can end up stuck between worlds, the Bardo Thodol points to multiple layers of impediments. The first chain is sheer unbridled fear. When an unprepared consciousness realizes the body is gone, the typical reflex is panic. The mind may rail against the finality of bodily death, attempting to re-enter a state that no longer exists. This can leave the soul in a fog of confusion, perceiving only echoes of the life it left behind. The second chain is attachment, an equally potent tether that keeps souls clinging to familiar people possessions or unresolved emotional bonds. In life, these bonds can be comforting or even virtuous, but in death, they become anchors that prevent a smooth and liberated passage through the bardos. Karma, often misunderstood as mere reward or punishment, forms the underlying current that sweeps the soul along after death. It represents the cumulative energetic imprints left by each intention, action, and thought throughout one's existence. This accumulated momentum can propel the soul upward to lighter, more peaceful realms, or downward to denser, more turbulent ones, depending on the nature of the imprints. According to the text, karmic residue is not merely a metaphor, it is an actual force that influences our experiences, creating an internal landscape that reflects our emotional and ethical history. In the bardo state, these karmic patterns can take on vivid, even personified forms, divine beings, or wrathful demons, none of which exist independently of the individual's mind. To complicate matters further, a soul might not realize it has died and remain wandering in spaces that reflect its attachments or illusions. Some do not recognize family members have become inaccessible, or that their own words and gestures can no longer be perceived by the living. They linger in a gray realm, neither fully in the physical world nor completely transitioning to the spiritual one. This limbo can persist for as long as the soul's confusion lingers, fueled by the inertia of habits it cannot relinquish. In certain stories, souls behold their own funeral ceremonies, or attempt to communicate with loved ones, only to be met by silence and an inability to influence worldly affairs. Yet the Bardo Thodol does not present these scenarios as inescapable tragedies. Instead, they are frames of mind that can be transcended if the awareness is sharp enough to identify illusions for what they are. The text stresses the primary importance of recognizing. Recognition here means understanding that everything we see in the after-death state, from glimpses of a blissful paradise to horrifying apparitions, arises from within our own mind. In other words, we confront ourselves in the form of external scenery. This is precisely why a person's spiritual or mental training prior to death can transform what might have been a harrowing ordeal into a peaceful or even enlightening experience. Whether the illusions are pleasant or terrifying, the key is to grasp. They are projections, much like a dream. Following the initial phase of separation described as the Chikai Bardo, the consciousness may transition into what the text calls the Chonyid Bardo. Here, the illusions intensify, taking on breathtakingly vivid forms that mirror one's deepest mental states. Some individuals recount floating into vast realms of extraordinary beauty, a place where golden palaces and benevolent beings glow with a radiance that surpasses any earthly splendor. For others, by contrast, the passage can be populated by terrifying otherworldly creatures, brandishing fierce visages and producing unbearable roars. Yet the crucial teaching in the Bardo Thodol is that these entities, whether tranquil or monstrous, are all manifestations of the same source, the mind of the individual traversing this state. We might be tempted to think of these illusions as being akin to dreams, but the text cautions that they are more intense than dreams as we normally experience them. Free from the constraints of a physical body and the typical senses, the mind can project images with a compelling immediacy that dwarfs ordinary imagination. If in life a person harbored unresolved rage, guilt, or jealousy, it can crystallize in the afterlife as wrathful deities that appear hostile or monstrous. Conversely, if someone cultivated love, compassion, and peace, they might perceive serene landscapes and luminous guides. Yet in both instances, the illusions are ephemeral. They can neither harm nor save unless the soul becomes enthralled by them. An elegant description encapsulated by Tibetan Buddhists is that these illusions have no intrinsic existence apart from the perceiver. The moment you accept them as real, by fleeing in terror from a menacing figure, or by reaching out desperately to cling to a glorious heavenly being, you reinforce their power over you. The illusions then become more tangible, deeply binding you in a cycle that drags you further from the recognition of the clear light, the essential ground of awareness. The Bardo Thodol advises that the best response is neither to recoil from horrific visions, nor to chase the comforting ones, but to remain calm and see them as the play of consciousness. Several teachers illustrate this dynamic with a mirror analogy. If your mind is like a mirror, all these visions, benevolent or vicious, are reflections. You do not curse the mirror for the reflection, nor do you worship the image. Instead, you see that both the reflection and the mirror are intricately connected. One does not truly exist independently of the other. In acknowledging this, the illusions begin to collapse, revealing what the text calls the luminous void, where form and formlessness merge into the same basic ground of being. For those who remain steadfast and do not attach the afterlife journey, can move toward liberation with surprising directness. Yet the Bardo Thodol also concedes that most will not recognize this interplay of mind and illusion. Overpowered by fear or seduced by yearning, the untrained soul will sink deeper into confusion, eventually reaching a juncture where karmic forces reel it back into another life. At that point, the opportunity to break the cycle of birth and death slips away, at least until the next transition arises. This is the reason why adherents of Tibetan Buddhism take seriously the practice of mind training, especially in cultivating the ability to watch illusions in life without reactivity, so they can repeat the same feat after death. Central to these teachings is the underlying conviction that the afterlife is not an external domain of judgment, but a mirror reflecting your own internal state. The text presents neither heaven nor hell as permanent locations assigned by an omnipotent being. Instead, it insists that if we inhabit a personal hell after death, it arises from unprocessed pain, regret, or negative actions. Likewise, if we dwell momentarily in a lovely celestial realm, it results from compassionate actions, altruism, or devotion, cultivated throughout our lives. In either case, these post-mortem realms are ephemeral. They shift according to the changing landscapes of the mind, echoing the illusions we still hold. The notion that everything you see as you extends beyond mere metaphor. It forms the core interpretive lens of the Bardo Thodol, explaining why some souls encounter terrifying beings, while others perceive radiant deities. The righteous or terrorizing figures they meet are essentially externalized aspects of their own consciousness. This explanation underscores a critical lesson. If you take responsibility for your inner world in life, you are better positioned to navigate it after death. Conversely, if you remain unconscious of your emotional baggage, unaddressed traumas, or unresolved hostility, those elements may resurface in the bardo as monstrous apparitions. Among the illusions described, some are wrathful deities, brandishing weapons, exuding fearsome roars, or appearing to tear at the sky. The immediate human instinct is to cower or to flee from them. However, from the perspective of the text, these wrathful images do not represent evil external forces, but rather the raw, unfiltered energies of our own mind energies that we suppressed or misunderstood in life. The recommended approach is not aggression, but recognition, by holding steady, by not collapsing into panic. One can watch these menacing forms lose their frightening grip, they diminish like shadows that cannot withstand direct light. At a later stage, the illusions transition again, this time taking on the form of peaceful deities or comforting ancestors. Luminous guides and angelic figures appear coaxing the soul with warmth and radiance. This phase can be equally deceptive if the soul clings to these manifestations as something external or separate. In that clinging, a subtle form of attachment arises, which can then lead the mind away from ultimate realization. It becomes a form of spiritual seduction, where the soul wants to merge with the vision out of desire rather than awareness. For the advanced practitioner, the safest path is once again to recognize these forms as projections of one's own higher nature, and to neither worship nor reject them. If the illusions, whether gentle or terrifying, are seen through the path to liberation, opens wider. In that sense, the Bardo Thodol depicts the afterlife almost like a labyrinth of illusions requiring steady discernment. Falling into fear or desire at any point can propel the consciousness into another incarnation, repeating the same cycles of confusion. On the other hand, sustained clarity at each juncture can lift the soul beyond all illusions into a state described as an unbounded luminous void or the clear light of awareness. This is the potential final exit from what Buddhists call samsara, the cyclical existence of birth, death, and rebirth. After cycling through these visionary experiences, wrathful and peaceful alike, the consciousness faces what the text calls the Sidpa Bardo, often delineated as the stage where rebirth into a new body becomes increasingly probable unless one's awareness remains unshaken. Karmic forces, shaped by each individual's accumulated actions and intentions, act like an invisible tide carrying the soul into the circumstances it is most magnetically drawn to. This may mean glimpsing prospective parents or sensing the environment that will host the next incarnation, all of which is steered by lingering desires, attachments, or unfinished business. For many, the gravitational pull of unresolved karma is nearly irresistible, ushering them into yet another cycle of physical existence. In this view, reincarnation is not a punishment or even a cosmic mandate. Rather, it is a direct consequence of the individual's mental and emotional momentum. Those who held strong cravings in life, whether for love, material, comfort, vengeance, or anything else, remain tethered to experiences that mirror those cravings. Others who cultivated wisdom and compassion, but still hold subtle attachments, might find themselves in more harmonious rebirths, yet still within the wheel of samsara. The Bardo Thodol is unequivocal. Only by dissolving attachment at the root can the cycle be broken entirely, allowing consciousness to merge with the vast source that lies beyond all form. A smaller number of souls, according to the text, see through the entire process. They realize that they need not follow the currents pushing them toward rebirth. For these rare individuals, the illusions in the Bardo are recognized for what they are, and the call of reincarnation weakens. Imagine standing by the edge of a river, once pulled by its swift current, then suddenly perceiving a solid path leading away from the water entirely. The text describes that letting go of the self is paramount if one is to truly step away from the cycle. It requires relinquishing identity, not only as we knew it in our recent earthly life, but on every conceivable level. This can be a daunting leap, for it involves transcending the very sense of I that has persisted over numerous lifetimes. Remarkably, this is precisely what many Tibetan Buddhist monks spend their days preparing for. Through sustained meditation, breathwork, and practices of visualization, They train to face illusions without reacting to dissolve attachments before death forcibly separates them from their physical form. By doing so, they hope to maintain a calm, lucid awareness that endures even as the body decays, allowing them to navigate the afterlife states with clarity. For them, the real preparation is not about memorizing lines from the Bardo Thodol, but embodying its teachings, making the mind pliable enough to move beyond illusions. When they approach death, their training is put to the ultimate test. Remain still and awake as the illusions swirl in front of them or be carried away again by old habits and unfulfilled desires. Seen from another angle, the teachings of the Bardo Thodol offer profound parallels to the phenomenon we call near-death experiences. NDEs reported in modern times by individuals who briefly die in medical settings but are then resuscitated. Many describe sensations of traveling through tunnels of light, encountering welcoming presences, or viewing a panoramic review of their lives in what feels like mere seconds. Scientists studying these experiences have begun to acknowledge startling commonalities across cultures and belief systems. The resemblances stretch beyond mere light or tunnel imagery. Individuals often report encountering deceased relatives, divine figures, or powerful beings that match their personal or cultural frame of reference. Some even speak of an overwhelming feeling of acceptance or unconditional love, while others recall frightening or puzzling phenomena. Neuroscientists point to the surge of brain activity, sometimes measured at the point of clinical death, as a possible explanation. They suggest that this final spike of neurological firing could be responsible for the vivid experiences and cosmic visions that NDE participants bring back. Yet from the perspective of Tibetan Buddhism, this scientific discovery harmonizes well with the concept that consciousness persists briefly even after the body is no longer viable. The surge might correspond to the moment consciousness detaches from the physical vessel and transitions into the Chikai Bardo, or something akin to it. While science frames this in terms of measurable brain activity, the Bardo Thodol frames it as the mind's natural unfolding process, shaped by karma and mental tendencies. Quantum physics, too, nudges us toward questioning the nature of reality itself. Some interpretations argue that reality is not as solid or discrete as we assume, and that consciousness may play an active role in shaping the experience of matter and energy. In that light, the Bardo Thodol concept that post-death visions are projections of consciousness doesn't appear nearly as far-fetched as it might have seemed in an earlier era. Though Western scientific discourse typically avoids language like soul or spirit, a growing body of research on consciousness and the observer effect in physics opens intriguing avenues for dialogue between empirical science and these ancient Tibetan teachings. One of the most potent implications of aligning modern science with the Bardo Thodol is the shift in perspective it invites. If consciousness indeed continues in some form after the brain ceases to function, even for a brief period, then the question of what to do with that consciousness takes on monumental importance. Tibetan masters would contend that how we cultivate our minds while alive directly shapes the possibilities we face in that intermediate state. It is not a matter of superstitious piety, but of deliberate and disciplined training. If your everyday reality is governed by fear, excessive desire, or unexamined impulses, you might expect that same confused dynamic to blossom uncontrollably when you enter the Bardo. On the other hand, if you have cultivated stability, compassion, and clear awareness, the illusions of the Bardo need not overwhelm you. Instead, they can serve as catalysts for deeper realization or even ultimate liberation. Alongside its explanations of post-mortem visions, the Bardo Thodol provides practical insights that extend into daily life. The instructions and warnings it offers are not exclusively relevant for the deceased or the dying. Rather, they have crucial implications for the living. If, for instance, the illusions we encounter after death are magnified reflections of our mind's contents, then learning to master our thoughts, emotions, and attachments while we are still alive becomes vital. The process of meditation, of gently observing and releasing thoughts as they arise, is thus more than just a stress management tool. It is a rehearsal for the moment when the veil of physical existence lifts and we confront our mental reality in its rawest, most amplified form. In Western societies, death is often painted as the ultimate taboo, a distressing event we either sanitize medically or avoid discussing in polite conversation. This cultural discomfort means that when death does arrive, whether it's our own or that of a loved one, people frequently feel ill-prepared. Fear, denial, and regret compound the natural grief process. But from the Tibetan perspective, it is precisely by bringing death awareness into everyday consciousness that we learn to live more wholeheartedly. The premise is that if you do not fear death, your decisions in life can be shaped by clarity and love rather than anxiety or clinging. You are more likely to cherish present moments, forgive more readily, and cultivate virtues like compassion and equanimity, knowing that these are the mental states that will follow you beyond the threshold of death. Moreover, the text underscores that if you can learn to die each day in a small way, letting go of petty concerns, destructive emotions, or rigid self-identities, you gradually build the muscle of detachment. This practice trains you to remain calm in situations where familiar reference points dissolve, whether that dissolution is triggered by crisis, radical change, or eventually physical death. When you are accustomed to letting illusions pass through your mind without grasping, you are less liable to plunge into panic or delusion during the Bardo states. This vantage aligns with the many Buddhist teachings about cultivating mindfulness and practicing little deaths of the ego on a daily basis. The text also addresses a question often raised by skeptics. If these illusions are internal, why do they appear so vividly, sometimes even shared by multiple observers? The Buddhist response typically rests on the subtle interdependence of consciousness, while the core illusions might be unique to each mind. Cultural and collective belief systems can give them archetypal forms. This is one reason why certain figures, wrathful or peaceful, appear across generations in Tibetan iconography, shaping the experiences of practitioners who have internalized these images. Yet fundamentally, these are still personal illusions, reflective of the mind's own karmic traces. Hence, the emphasis remains on individual recognition. Even if two souls encounter similarly wrathful or luminous deities, their capacity to respond with equanimity or fear is determined by their unique inner landscape. Fascinatingly, the Bardo Thodol also touches on the phenomenon of souls who cannot cross over. While the text does not dwell on notions of ghosts or haunting in the sensational sense, it does describe how certain souls, weighed down by powerful attachments or unresolved wishes, may remain in a kind of limbo. This limbo is not a punishment inflicted by external forces. It is a self-created stasis that arises from the refusal to accept that life, as it was physically known, has ended. Those souls might hover around their former dwellings, cling to living relatives, or attempt to influence events they no longer have the power to control. These attachments, whether rooted in love or regret, can become chains that tether the consciousness to the fringes of the material world. This perspective casts a fresh light on the topic of unfinished business, a phrase that frequently appears in counseling or therapeutic settings. From a Tibetan standpoint, leaving significant relationships or life situations in a state of turmoil can have repercussions beyond this lifespan, potentially trapping the individual in patterns of longing or remorse. This is why a consistent thread in Buddhist teachings is the cultivation of a peaceful, forgiving heart, making amends where possible and learning to let go where necessary. The idea is that if the mind is unburdened by regrets, bitterness, or clinging at the time of death, it can transition through the bardos more gracefully. Conversely, the more one carries negative mental baggage, the more likely it is to color and complicate the journey that follows. All the same, the Bardo Thodol never suggests these states are permanent. Even those who linger are said to still have pathways toward eventual realization, although it may be more difficult. According to the text, such souls are often repeatedly drawn toward the luminous guidance that appears in the intermediate state, but they turn away each time out of fear or attachment. Over time, their own karma will either propel them into a rebirth that allows them a new start, or they may finally accept the illusions for what they are, releasing themselves into a more enlightened condition. This is one reason the text advises the living to maintain rituals and prayers that send loving, guiding energies to the recently departed in hopes of aiding them through confusion. The bridging mechanism then remains awareness. When the illusions, attachments, and fears of the newly deceased soul are confronted by calm understanding, their hold weakens. The illusions do not necessarily vanish overnight, but they can dissolve once recognized. Tibetan spirituality upholds that clarity is the single greatest asset one can bring to death: clarity of mind, clarity of intention, and clarity of the impermanent nature of all conditioned phenomena. Achieving this clarity is an ongoing practice, which is why many practitioners begin preparing long before they expect to die, weaving mindful living and spiritual insight into their everyday routines. This synergy between life and death underscores the text's ultimate point. Death is less a final punctuation mark and more a shift in the continuum of consciousness for which we can consciously prepare. One of the more startling assertions in the Bardo Thodol is the availability of a window right at the moment of death, a narrow period in which the radiance of the clear light presents itself with full force. For many individuals, this brilliant radiance is too overwhelming, akin to gazing directly at the sun without preparation. The instinctive response is to recoil, to seek something familiar, like the memory of a body, a comforting voice, or a place in time that used to feel like home. The text emphasizes that this moment is critical because it offers the first and arguably the most potent chance to attain liberation. The soul that has trained diligently, cultivating the ability to remain unshaken by intense experiences, can recognize that this radiant light is none other than the essence of its own mind, expansive, boundless, and profoundly peaceful. However, the majority of souls lacking that training pull back in fright or confusion. This initial recoil sets the stage for the illusions and karmic visions that follow. Once the clear light is missed, the consciousness typically plunges into more elaborate and personified expressions of its underlying fears and desires. In many respects, this progression mirrors the layers of mental abstraction we encounter in dreams. Imagine being given the ultimate clarity for a moment, and failing to comprehend it, only to then wander through labyrinthine dream sequences, shaped by personal anxieties, unresolved conflicts, or latent aspirations. That, in essence, is how the Bardo Thodol depicts the post-mortem journey that unfolds for most beings. To prepare for this pivotal moment, Tibetan monks engage in meditative practices that aim to simulate the dissolution of the senses and the dissolution of conceptual thinking. Over decades of training, they become intimately aware of how the mind reacts when deprived of its usual sensory inputs, learning to hold a stable awareness even in these disorienting states. It is said that certain advanced practitioners can actually rehearse their own deaths repeatedly in the mind, gradually dismantling the reflexes of fear and attachment. By the time they face the real process of dying, they are able to greet that intense brilliance as an old friend. The Bardo Thodol serves as the textual framework for this practice, but the actual transformation takes place in the mind and heart of the practitioner through years of dedication. Meanwhile, for the average person with minimal exposure to such teachings, encountering the brilliance after death can be akin to stepping into a landscape of blinding whiteness, not realizing that the brilliance is emanating from within. This confusion is why the text is read to the deceased, so that at the critical junctures the soul might be reminded not to fear the radiance, but to merge with it. Of course, the text itself is but a guide. The actual recognition must come from the individual's own cultivated awareness. This interplay of textual guidance and personal realization is reminiscent of a map and a traveler. A map can show you every road, every potential pitfall, but if you lack the capacity to walk the path or interpret the signs, even the best map might not suffice. Historically, the Bardo Thodol was hidden for centuries, known only in select monastic circles. When it eventually appeared in the Western imagination, it stirred considerable debate. Some dismissed it as an exotic myth from a medieval culture, while others embraced it as evidence of a far more intricate understanding of consciousness than was available in Western psychology at the time. The secrecy that initially shrouded the text is often attributed to concerns that these teachings could be misunderstood, misapplied, or exploited by those seeking spiritual powers rather than liberation. The esoteric practices associated with it, such as visualization of deities, recitation of mantras, and specific breath work, were intended to be transmitted within a lineage under the tutelage of a qualified master. Why then has the text gained such prominence in more recent decades? One perspective suggests that global consciousness is changing, that modern seekers from various backgrounds are more open to integrative views of mind science and spirituality. Another line of thought posits that the world faces numerous existential challenges, from environmental threats to social upheavals, and that the time is ripe for teachings that dissolve fear at its very root. Death anxiety, after all, is arguably one of the most fundamental drivers of human behavior. By confronting it directly, the Bardo Thodol challenges the illusions that keep us locked in cycles of fear, aggression, and material obsession. Modern religions, particularly in the West, often revolve around narratives of judgment and salvation. The promise is that moral rectitude, or faith in a higher power, can secure one's place in paradise, while wrongdoing or disbelief might precipitate eternal punishment. The Bardo Thodol cuts through these externalized frameworks by suggesting that the judge, the heaven, and the hell all reside within the mind. No cosmic authority is meting out verdicts. Instead, the energies we have cultivated shape the experiences we undergo after death. This perspective can be liberating, but it also places profound responsibility on the individual. There is no easy scapegoat, no deity to blame. If one experiences a hellish realm, that realm arises from the seeds planted in one's own consciousness. The flip side, of course, is that we always hold the potential for transformation. Even in the bardo states, if we manage to awaken to the nature of the illusions, we can pivot toward liberation. This sense of inherent self-determination unsettles many institutionalized forms of religion and governance that profit from fear or hierarchical dependence. A populace that no longer dreads hellfire or yearns for heavenly reward can be harder to control. It comes as little surprise, then, that such a text might have been considered dangerous. By teaching that ultimate salvation is an inward realization rather than an external verdict, the Bardo Thodol disrupts systems reliant on fear-based obedience. If liberation is an inner awakening available to each individual, the locus of power shifts dramatically. The conversation between this ancient Tibetan text and contemporary science is one of the most intriguing aspects of its ongoing relevance. Accounts of near-death experiences have grown considerably over the last half-century, with doctors, nurses, and researchers collecting thousands of case reports. These range from stories of uniform tunnel and light episodes to more multifaceted narratives involving encounters with deceased relatives or religious figures from various faiths. Attempts to explain these phenomena through physiological or psychological processes such as oxygen deprivation, endorphin release, or a final burst of brain activity do not necessarily negate the deeper spiritual interpretations. Instead, they might offer a complementary perspective on what the Bardo Thodol describes as the natural unfolding of consciousness freed from its bodily constraints. Quantum theory adds yet another layer of complexity by questioning the firm boundary we draw between observer and observed. If consciousness influences what we perceive to be reality, then the illusions described in the Bardo Thodol could reflect a spectrum of possibilities arising from an observer-dependent cosmos. Traditional Tibetan Buddhism might frame it less in scientific jargon, but the principle that the mind projects and experiences its own reality resonates with certain quantum interpretations. The difference is that Tibetan practice does not only see this as an intellectual puzzle, but as a matter of deep personal consequence. Our illusions can bind us in suffering, or if recognized, lead to profound freedom. Additionally, cross-cultural perspectives highlight the universality of certain afterlife motifs. Many indigenous traditions hold beliefs about a spirit journey after death, fraught with tests, illusions, or guardians. The Bardo Thodol could be seen as a highly systematized, detailed manual of this universal phenomenon. By providing explicit guidance, reciting particular mantras, reminding the soul that what it encounters is a product of its own mind, the text offers a roadmap that might be missing in other cultural contexts. As such, even if one is not a practicing Buddhist, the conceptual framework of the Bardo Thodol can open new pathways for understanding what it means to die and, consequently, what it means to live. There are also parallels with certain psychotherapeutic approaches that deal with trauma or fears through visualization, effectively reprogramming the mind's response to stress or pain. Some psychonautical traditions employing entheogenic substances describe similar illusions and visionary encounters that must be navigated with mindfulness to avoid psychological harm. The Bardo Thodol stands as an ancient precursor to these contemporary explorations, emphasizing the importance of stable awareness and the recognition of illusions as keys to liberation rather than paths to further entrapment. By integrating its teachings with modern knowledge, one could argue that we gain a more holistic view of the human journey, bridging the gap between age-old spiritual wisdom and cutting-edge research into the nature of consciousness. Despite its revelations, the Bardo Thodol does not imply that every individual who hears these teachings will automatically navigate death with effortless grace. Much of the text underscores the necessity of preparation in life, what some might call spiritual or mental homework. In practical terms, this means developing a daily habit of meditation, self-reflection, ethical conduct, and compassion. These practices serve as a training ground for letting go of attachments. If a person cannot relinquish anger, envy, or a compulsive need for control in the everyday realm, it becomes far more challenging to drop them during the disorientation of the death process. The Tibetan monastic education system weaves many such practices into the daily routine, from silent sitting sessions to chanting mantras that cultivate compassion for all sentient beings. Breath control techniques like tummo or vase breathing further demonstrate how adept practitioners push the limits of physiological endurance to master the boundary between life and death. By learning to slow heart rate, withstand cold, or calm the mind in extreme conditions, these monks develop confidence in their ability to remain unmoved by the illusions that might flood them in the Bardo states. Such extraordinary feats are documented, from monks generating body heat in frigid mountain hermitages to accounts of individuals who pass away in deep meditative equipoise, leaving behind minimal bodily decay. Western societies are less accustomed to this level of commitment to the practice of dying. Death for many remains a medical event to be managed by professionals. Yet the existential truths pointed out by the Bardo Thodol can be valuable regardless of cultural background. They remind us that how we live is how we die. If we live in a constant state of fear or grasping, that mental state does not magically disappear when the body shuts down. In that sense, the text invites us to cultivate a kind of Bardo awareness, even while fully alive, recognizing that each moment is a transition, each breath a passing phenomenon that can be observed without reflexive clinging. One significant takeaway is that even if one does not adhere to the Buddhist cosmology or the notion of multiple reincarnations, the psychological truths embedded in the text can hold universal relevance. Our attachments, fears, and mental habits do shape our perceptions of reality, both while alive and as we approach death. The more skillful we become at distinguishing illusion from reality in our waking lives, the more prepared we are to do the same in any altered or transitional state, whether that state is the aftermath of physical death or a drastic life change that shatters our usual sense of self. Ultimately, the Bardo Thodol can be read as a manual for the mind, urging us to realize that from moment to moment we are shaping our experiences in ways we seldom acknowledge. As one progresses deeper into the intermediate states described by the Bardo Thodol, there comes a juncture frequently referred to as the last chance for liberation before karma decisively steers the soul toward rebirth. In this pivotal moment, luminous deities and ancestral guides might emerge, manifesting in forms that evoke serenity, compassion, and acceptance. These visions can reassure and pacify the mind, yet they too are illusions if perceived as external. The text implores the departed to recognize that these figures are expressions of one's own higher consciousness, and to merge with them rather than worship or long for them as something separate. For those unable to maintain that clarity, the illusions become stepping stones, leading them inexorably to the next incarnation. At that point, the soul may find itself irresistibly drawn to specific circumstances shaped by unresolved desires or karmic inclinations. The imagery in the text speaks of glimpsing one's future parents or being carried by a flow of energy toward a new womb. The experience might be subjectively pleasant or unpleasant, but it marks the close of the afterlife sojourn, only to begin anew in another form. Consequently, the cyclical nature of existence continues propelled by the illusions that the soul has yet to see through. From a broader perspective, this cyclical return is not necessarily bleak or dismal. Tibetan Buddhism often presents reincarnation as an opportunity to refine understanding, to cultivate virtues, and to move closer to awakening. It is also recognized that some highly realized beings, bodhisattvas, may choose to return voluntarily, motivated by compassion, to help liberate others. This nuance underscores that the Bardo journey need not be viewed purely as a threat of perpetual entrapment, but as an arena of both challenge and spiritual potential. The key lies in whether we remain unconscious participants in the karmic dance or become conscious navigators of our own mind. The text aims to equip us with the latter possibility. One of the recurring themes is that each vision or bardo state is in essence an unveiling of mental processes that have always been active but were masked by physical existence. Stripped of the body's limiting filters, the mind's capacity to generate worlds heavenly or hellish becomes evident. This perspective resonates with the experiences of advanced meditators who during deep retreats report that the lines between external phenomena and internal states can blur significantly. The illusions in the bardo are an extension of this principle playing out in a realm beyond the physical. Hence, if we can learn to stabilize our awareness in meditation, we are practicing the skill of recognizing illusions without indulging them, a skill that can be applied in the tumultuous experiences after death just as easily as in the swirl of daily thought. Dovetailing with these insights, Tibetan Buddhism articulates a range of rituals designed for the time of dying aimed at facilitating a smoother transition. One such ritual is known as phowa, or the transference of consciousness. When performed successfully, it is believed to allow a practitioner or a dying individual, guided by a skilled lama, to transfer consciousness directly into a pure realm, or a higher dimension of awareness at the moment of death. This technique involves intense concentration on a point at the crown of the head, and a visualization of consciousness rising through that point, culminating in a swift, unobstructed passage that bypasses many of the illusions in the bardos. Similarly, certain chants or mantras might be whispered into the ear of the dying person. These serve as auditory cues to remind them of the nature of their mind, encouraging them to stay alert to illusions and to not become ensnared by fear or desire. Some families keep vigil at a deathbed for hours after breathing has stopped, believing that consciousness may linger and thus can still benefit from hearing these mantras. While such practices may appear mysterious or superstitious to the uninitiated, they are systematically woven into Tibetan monastic training as potent tools for ensuring the mind remains stable and oriented toward enlightenment when it is most vulnerable. The efficacy of these practices is challenging to measure in empirical terms, but anecdotal accounts of monks passing away in seated meditation with no sign of decomposition for days have intrigued Western medical observers. In Tibetan law, certain venerated practitioners enter a state called thukdam after clinical death, wherein the physical signs of death appear largely absent, while the meditator's consciousness purportedly remains in deep absorption, gradually disengaging from the body. This phenomenon confounds conventional medical understanding, though it aligns closely with the Bardo Thodol's emphasis on the power of trained awareness to influence the process of dying. Moreover, the text's instructions about funeral rites and the best ways to support a soul in the Bardo highlight an ethic of care extending beyond physical life. For instance, survivors are encouraged to maintain an atmosphere of calm reverence and clarity around the deceased, avoiding excessive displays of grief that might confuse or distress the departed consciousness. Offerings and prayers are often dedicated to easing the soul's passage and reinforcing the soul's capacity for recognition. While these practices may be foreign to a purely materialist worldview, they resonate with the text's foundational principle that consciousness remains receptive to input, especially in the fragile state following the cessation of bodily functions. Therefore, an environment imbued with compassion and mindful intention can genuinely assist the departed in orienting themselves within the labyrinth of the bardos. Embedded in the core of the Bardo Thodol is a radical redefinition of life itself. If we accept that the after-death experiences are shaped by the mind, then the difference between life and death is less stark than we typically imagine. The illusions we face in the Bardo are in a sense an intensified reflection of the illusions we carry daily. Consider the ephemeral nature of emotions, how quickly anger can arise, how swiftly joy can fade, how illusions of security or identity can be shattered by a single event. In life, these illusions move alongside a backdrop of relative stability provided by the physical body and the familiar environment. Once those anchors are removed, the illusions and mental energies that remain can explode into an immersive, experiential reality. From this vantage point, daily meditation and mindfulness training can be viewed as microcosmic rehearsals for the Bardo state. Each time we notice a thought but refuse to become lost in its narrative, we are practicing a skill that will become invaluable after death. Each time we experience a surge of fear, envy, or desire in the midst of everyday challenges and choose to meet it with awareness, we are learning how to prevent illusions from overwhelming us. Conversely, if we accumulate a lifetime's habit of avoidance or reactivity, we may struggle greatly when confronted with the far more potent illusions of the Bardo. Importantly, the text does not intend to instill fear. It aims to inspire constructive action and reflection. By bringing the notion of the Bardo into everyday awareness, we become more attuned to the fluid nature of reality. We may notice how each transition, finishing a job, ending a relationship, or even shifting our mood has a Bardo-like quality of in-betweenness, where the old reference points have dissolved, but the new ones have yet to crystallize. Practitioners are advised to see these transitional moments as opportunities for awakening microcosms of the grand transition that follows physical death. Another intriguing aspect is that many Tibetans hold communal rituals to help those who have passed, emphasizing the collective dimension of spiritual practice. Through prayers, ceremonies, and gatherings, they generate positive energies, believed to ease the transition for the departed soul. This communal approach speaks to a broader worldview where death is integrated into the social and spiritual fabric, not relegated to sterile rooms or hidden behind euphemisms. Communities that openly acknowledge death and practice mindful rituals often produce members who are less fearful of the dying process. This willingness to remain engaged with death as part of life underlines the Bardo Thodol's teaching that fear arises primarily from ignorance and denial, both of which can be dispelled by honest knowledge and compassionate collective support. Interestingly, as Western interest in meditation, mindfulness, and Tibetan Buddhism has expanded, more people from non-Buddhist backgrounds have begun to incorporate elements of the Bardo Thodol into their personal end-of-life preparations. Some choose to keep the text by their bedside, hoping to have its guidance available if they become conscious in the transitional states. Others arrange for close friends or spiritual counselors to recite relevant passages if they find themselves on the brink of death. While the full suite of Tibetan rituals may not be adopted wholesale, these adaptations reveal a growing recognition that the mind's condition at death deserves at least as much attention as the medical details of the dying process. From a purely psychological perspective, the text's approach to fear management and detachment can also offer solace. The knowledge that death might involve a discernible sequence of experiences and that we can prepare for it can mitigate anxiety for many who dread the unknown. Such an approach parallels palliative care philosophies that advocate for emotional and spiritual support in tandem with physical pain management. By providing a structured narrative about what may happen after the final heartbeat, the Bardo Thodol introduces a sense of continuity rather than abrupt annihilation. Even those who do not literally believe in Bardos might find the symbolic framework comforting as it provides a mindful way to engage with the idea of death rather than simply denying or fearing it. The text also forces us to question the ultimate nature of self. If we can exist without the body, if consciousness can persist in these Bardo states, then what does that imply about identity? Are we an essence that transcends the physical, or are we fluid patterns of energy and awareness that shift from one configuration to another? Tibetan Buddhism tends toward the latter explanation, teaching that there is no fixed eternal soul, but rather a continuum of consciousness driven by karmic imprints. The illusions in the Bardo become the stage upon which these karmic forces are displayed. If we cling to a rigid sense of I, we remain on that stage. If we recognize that the self is already an illusion, we may exit it altogether. This theme resonates with non-dual philosophies across various wisdom traditions. The distinction between self and other subject and object can collapse in moments of deep insight. Tibetan teachers frequently describe the ultimate goal as recognizing that the clear light of awareness is identical to one's true nature. Meeting death, therefore, becomes a supreme test of this recognition. Viewed in this light, the Bardo Thodol is not just a spiritual text, but a meticulously detailed psychological system, guiding us towards self-knowledge that transcends the boundary we typically call death. As more people from diverse backgrounds explore these ideas, the universal applicability of the teachings becomes increasingly evident. One of the recurring questions facing anyone who delves into the Bardo Thodol is whether its descriptions of afterlife states are literal or symbolic. Skeptics might dismiss them as elaborate allegories for the dissolution of the psyche, while devout practitioners might treat every word as a precise map of an actual spiritual territory. There is a middle ground, however, embraced by many Tibetan lamas, who argue that the question of literal versus symbolic misses the central point. Whether the wrathful deities and peaceful deities are real external entities or purely internal phenomena, the practical guidance remains the same. You must not be swayed by fear or longing. You must recognize them as projections of your own mind and maintain clarity. This approach is reminiscent of how certain psychological frameworks handle dream analysis. Whether you believe your dream figures have an autonomous existence or not, understanding that they represent aspects of yourself can lead to healing insights. The Bardo Thodol similarly encourages us to approach post-mortem visions with a clarity that sees beyond surface appearances. If, for example, a monstrous figure threatens to devour you, it symbolizes the energy of your own unacknowledged rage or terror. Recognize it as such, and you rob it of its power. Succumb to it with panic, and you amplify its reality, pulling yourself deeper into the labyrinth of illusion. Additionally, The text encourages us not to become complacent, even if we encounter the most sublime visions, celestial palaces, exquisite music, divine beings offering blissful greetings. On the surface, these appear far more appealing than monstrous forms, but the text cautions that they too can be illusions. Attaching to these bright illusions is a subtler trap, tempting the consciousness into a false sense of permanent refuge. Once the consciousness invests them with ultimate value, it remains in the dualistic framework of I and the paradise I want. Inevitably, that longing leads back to another cycle of birth and death. For those prepared to see through all illusions both horrific and heavenly, the Bardo Thodol lays out a path to dissolve entirely into what is sometimes termed the Dharmakaya, or the formless dimension of truth. In some Buddhist traditions, this final dissolution is described as returning to the ocean of pure awareness. The analogy often used is that of a wave on the ocean. Once it realizes it is water, it can never again see itself as separate. The small wave merges back into the vast sea, and the illusion of separation disappears. In human terms, that wave is our sense of a separate self, which clings to life form and identity. When that sense dissolves, liberation is said to dawn. This teaching is not unique to Tibet. It resonates through various branches of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, and even parallels aspects of Hindu Advaita Vedanta and certain mystical streams of Christianity and Islam. Moreover, the Bardo Thodol emphasizes that even if one has not spent a lifetime cultivating deep meditative abilities, moments of grace can still arise during the Bardo states. Sometimes fear itself provokes a sudden clarity, prompting the soul to look inward rather than outward. In other cases, a compassionate presence, whether an actual spiritual master or the projection of the soul's own compassion, can deliver a spark of recognition. The text underscores that the lines between external help and internal resources become blurred after death, as everything is ultimately a reflection of consciousness. Thus, what appears as an external guru in the Bardo might be the latent wisdom seeded in the mind through fleeting but meaningful encounters during life. Yet this potential for grace does not negate the importance of conscious effort. The entire premise of the text is that training the mind in life profoundly impacts the soul's experience in death. The Bardo Thodol is not a ticket guaranteeing a blissful afterlife. It is a manual that must be internalized through experience. Reading or hearing the text at the moment of dying can help jog a memory that was formed through diligent practice. If there is no underlying familiarity with mindful awareness, the words might ring hollow when illusions crescendo. Additionally, there are cultural variations in how these teachings are integrated. Some Tibetan lineages incorporate lively rituals with colorful thangka paintings depicting the fierce and gentle deities, reinforcing the idea that the next world is teeming with vivid possibilities. Other lineages might emphasize a more austere meditative approach, reminding practitioners that all these forms are empty. The Bardo Thodol itself is not a monolithic text. It is part of a living tradition that has adapted to different historical and social contexts while preserving its core message. Ironically, in today's globalized environment, one can find the Bardo Thodol in popular bookstores, complete with commentary aimed at Western readers. This democratization of once secret teachings invites new ethical questions. Are we trivializing or oversimplifying something that was guarded for centuries, or does the widespread availability of these instructions fulfill Padmasambhava's original intention to share them when the time was right? The best answer likely lies in how sincerely one approaches the study and practice. If the text is merely consumed as an exotic curiosity, its deeper efficacy might be lost. If, however, it serves as a gateway to genuine introspection and transformation, then its release into the wider world may well be timely and beneficial. What remains constant is that the text rests on a premise both astonishing and deeply pragmatic, that death can be navigated consciously, and that with the right preparation, the illusions that appear at life's end can be used as stepping stones to discover the truth of what we are, beyond the physical form. By continuously reminding the soul that fear, attachment, and longing are illusions constructed by the mind itself, the Bardo Thodol extends a promise of unimaginable freedom to anyone willing to undertake the necessary inner work. Crucially, the Bardo Thodol underscores the pivotal truth that none of these illusions, whether wrathful or serene, possess intrinsic reality if the consciousness facing them remains fully aware. This principle parallels a vital theme in many Buddhist teachings. All phenomena are empty of inherent existence, yet they appear and can deeply affect us if we invest them with reality. Emotions, relationships, social constructs, and personal identities hold sway in our daily lives, precisely because we often forget their impermanent and constructed nature. Death simply peels away the usual layers of distraction and reveals the mind's creativity in an undiluted form. This revelation of mind's potency can be shocking or enlightening depending on whether we have cultivated the skill to remain centered. Imagine the difference between someone who has never practiced swimming being dropped into a tempestuous sea versus someone who has calmly swum in challenging waters countless times. The text's repeated emphasis on recognition, recognize that this is a projection of your mind, do not fear it, do not cling to it, functions like a life raft for the newly departed. Without prior familiarity, the illusions act as waves that can easily overwhelm us. Yet even among those well versed in these teachings, liberation is not portrayed as a guarantee. Human beings are complex. We may hold certain spiritual insights on an intellectual level, but our emotional patterns can still lead us astray. We might carry hidden resentments, deeply repressed fears, or cravings that flourish when freed from bodily constraints. The Bardo Thodol acknowledges these realities by detailing how the illusions can shift dramatically if we become seduced by a fleeting desire or paralyzed by sudden dread. It is in this vulnerable space that the years or lifetimes of practice in self-inquiry, compassion, and meditation are truly tested. It also highlights a perspective on karma that diverges from simplistic reward and punishment models. Karma here is akin to momentum energy that we have continuously generated through our actions and thoughts. This momentum persists after death and sculpts the illusions we encounter, the deities we see, and even the impetus for rebirth. When we intentionally foster positive mental states such as kindness, patience, and wisdom, we gradually shift this momentum in a more enlightened direction, potentially making the Bardo journey smoother and more conducive to recognition. On the other hand, sustained hatred, envy, and selfishness accumulate a destructive force that can fuel nightmarish visions and painful rebirths. The process is neither random nor imposed from the outside. It is deeply personal, shaped by our own mind stream. Ultimately, the text moves us to ask, what if we took our mental habits as seriously in life as the Bardo Thodol suggests we should in death? If we become mindful of each reactive pattern, each clinging or aversion, we can transform them here and now. Doing so would not only enhance our life on earth, but also, according to the text, set the stage for a more conscious passage when our final breath inevitably arrives. A central motif running through all these teachings is impermanence. In Buddhism, impermanence is one of the three marks of existence alongside suffering dukkha and non-self anatta. The Bardo Thodol extends this theme by illustrating how impermanence continues after death. Even the illusions of heaven or hell are fleeting if one perceives them for what they are. Nothing in these realms, no matter how dazzling or dreadful, has the solidity we often attribute to our earthly environment. This revelation can be simultaneously disconcerting and freeing. It is disconcerting for those who yearn for permanence, for a stable ground upon which to rest. It is freeing for those who embrace that absolute security is unattainable and that liberation lies in letting go of the desire for it. Throughout the text, parallels to dream states recur as a key analogy. Dreams feel tangible and immediate when we are within them, often to the point of evoking intense emotions, fear, joy, sadness, or relief. Yet when we awaken, we can reflect on the dream as an ephemeral creation of the mind. In the Bardo, the entire experience of reality becomes dreamlike, but with the difference that we are no longer anchored by a biological body or a shared social consensus of what is real. In dream yoga, a Tibetan Buddhist practitioners learn to become aware that they are dreaming while still in the dream, thereby gaining control over its content. The Bardo Thodol can be viewed as a form of death yoga, teaching us to remain lucid in the ultimate dream that follows the cessation of the physical body. From a practical standpoint, this also means that we can cultivate attitudes of kindness, forgiveness, and equanimity in life, because these qualities do not vanish upon death. Instead, they shape how we face the illusions that arise, the profound sense of remorse or shame that some souls feel after death, realizing how certain choices or omissions contributed to suffering, can be mitigated by living in a manner that fosters harmony and understanding. Likewise, a soul that has nurtured compassion and wisdom might, upon encountering terrifying illusions, muster enough self-possession to recognize these as ephemeral mind projections. Of course, not everyone resonates with the Buddhist concept of multiple rebirths or the role of karma as a cosmic shaping force. However, the intangible essence of these teachings can still hold universal appeal: the necessity of facing our fears, the power of awareness in transforming suffering, and the possibility that what we experience in the afterlife, if anything, could be intimately connected to our mental state here and now. Even within purely secular frameworks, the psychological insights that illusions can dominate our perception and that recognition of illusions can dissolve their hold remain valuable. Regardless of one's background, the question of how to handle the final transition in life is inescapable. The Bardo Thodol offers a roadmap, but each traveler must decide how or whether to use it. The text also highlights collective karmic influences. While the focus is predominantly on the individual's journey, Tibetan Buddhism acknowledges that families, communities, and entire societies generate collective karma. This can manifest as shared illusions or shared conditions in rebirth. For example, individuals who have cultivated a deep spiritual bond might find themselves reborn in proximity to one another, continuing their work or resolving unfinished karma. On a larger scale, societies steeped in violence and exploitation may perpetuate conditions in which many souls repeatedly encounter destructive circumstances. Though this notion might sound abstract, it parallels a sociological view that unresolved trauma and ingrained cultural patterns can replicate harm across generations. In exploring these multi-layered dimensions of karma, the Bardo Thodol suggests that personal awakening is never isolated. Each person's liberation contributes to reducing the collective burdens of fear, anger, and ignorance. Conversely, destructive actions add to a communal web of darkness that future beings have to navigate. Thus, the impetus to practice compassion and clarity is not purely self-serving. It reverberates across connections that extend beyond a single lifetime. These interwoven karmic threads complicate the after-death experience, making it clear that the illusions one encounters may draw upon not only personal, but also collective energies and archetypes. Such reflections underline why some Tibetan masters, even upon attaining remarkable clarity, choose to return as tulkus or reincarnations of enlightened lamas, consciously re-entering the cycle of birth to aid other beings. Their advanced training allows them a measure of freedom to navigate rebirth, selecting conditions that align with their compassionate objectives. While this aspect might feel more mythic or esoteric to a modern audience, it illustrates the text's broader moral landscape. The Bardo journey is not merely about personal salvation. It hints at a shared spiritual responsibility for each other's awakening. Some modern practitioners also integrate these teachings into ecological or social activism, reasoning that if life is an ongoing continuum punctuated by bardos, then how we treat the planet and one another resonates far into the future. The illusions of separateness that degrade the environment or exploit vulnerable populations can be as damaging as the illusions encountered after death. In this way, the text can serve as a spiritual impetus for ethical action, mirroring the Buddhist principle of interdependence. When your neighbor's suffering is understood as part of your own karmic tapestry, motivations for compassion and equity expand beyond moral ideals. They become existential imperatives. All of these interpretations reinforce one of the text's central messages, that the mind's illusions are not trivial byproducts of daily life, but the decisive factor that shapes both our worldly experiences and our post-mortem realities. Whether you engage with it from a devout Buddhist angle, a comparative religious viewpoint, or a psychological self-help perspective, the Bardo Thodol continues to invite reflection on how intricately consciousness weaves the fabric of existence before, during, and after the moment we conventionally label as death. Some critics argue that the Bardo Thodol places an excessive burden on personal responsibility, suggesting that a traumatized or disadvantaged individual might have fewer opportunities to cultivate the composure necessary for clear recognition at death. Tibetan teachings, however, often respond with a reminder that countless lifetimes and myriad conditions contribute to each moment, implying that every being has at some point either cultivated or neglected the quality needed for liberation. Even the most seemingly hopeless situations can serve as catalysts for spiritual awakening if the individual summons the resolve to break destructive cycles. As it stands, the text never implies blame on any external agent. Instead, it highlights the complex interplay of karmic threads that produce our circumstances. There is also the question of elitism. Historically, only those within monastic institutions had the resources and time to extensively train in meditation and study. The modern dissemination of these teachings somewhat mitigates this exclusivity, offering everyday practitioners shorter, more accessible forms of mindfulness training and philosophical reflection. The recognition that not everyone can devote years in a remote hermitage has led to adaptations that still aim to convey the essence of the Bardo Thodol's instructions in more concise or practical formats. For instance, some centers teach guided bardo meditations that can be integrated into a standard work week, gradually helping practitioners internalize the recognition of illusions. Moreover, a broader cultural shift toward holistic end-of-life care is emerging in many parts of the world. Hospices increasingly incorporate meditation counseling and gentle awareness practices that can align with the Bardo Thodol's core messages. Palliative care specialists note that patients who embrace spiritual or psychological preparation often experience less anxiety and agitation, reinforcing the practical benefits of mindful acceptance. In these contexts, the text's wisdom can be applied ecumenically without requiring a complete conversion to Buddhist doctrine. Its fundamental instructions about releasing fear and attachment at the threshold of death can resonate with any open-minded seeker, whether they identify as Christian, Muslim, agnostic, or otherwise. Another angle explores how the Bardo Thodol's revelations about illusions might apply to traumatic experiences or mental health challenges in life. If monstrous visions in the Bardo reflect suppressed fears or guilt, then by extension, nightmares or flashbacks in waking life may also represent unprocessed inner material. Therapeutic approaches that encourage facing rather than fleeing disturbing images parallel the text's counsel about confronting illusions head-on. This psychological application can help individuals reduce the power of persistent mental phantoms. As such, the Bardo Thodol starts to appear less like a strictly religious manual and more like a deeply psychological treatise that can be harnessed for emotional healing well before death. Thus, the potential applications of these teachings transcend their cultural origins. Whether one employs them to prepare for the literal bardo after physical death or uses them to navigate life's smaller deaths and transformations, the overarching principle remains: illusions, when recognized, loosen their grip. That recognition arises through cultivated awareness, an ongoing deliberate practice that fosters a direct understanding of the mind's capacity to both ensnare and liberate. By consistently reminding us that even the most glorious post-mortem visions are illusions, the Bardo Thodol ultimately directs attention to what is beyond all illusions, the clear light or the empty luminosity from which phenomena arise. This is often described as the ultimate reality, sometimes referred to as the Dharmakaya in Tibetan Buddhist parlance, a state so subtle and profound that ordinary language falters. Poetic attempts describe it as infinite radiance without origin, the ground of being where subject and object collapse into a single vastness. In practical meditation, terms glimpsing this state even momentarily can unravel our entrenched convictions about the solidity of the world and the primacy of the personal ego. Reaching that realization is not merely about intellectual acknowledgement, but about a direct experiential shift. The text repeatedly warns that if one tries to cling to or conceptualize the clear light, it slips away like water through clenched fists. The clinging itself reconstitutes the sense of a separate I that desires union, thereby resurrecting the illusions of duality. The paradox is that the only way to achieve union is to relinquish the notion of a separate self entirely. Recognizing that the light and the observer of the light are not two separate things is, according to the text, the apex of the Bardo journey. Understandably, this teaching challenges many Western philosophical assumptions that treat consciousness as either a byproduct of the brain or an individual property belonging to a discrete self. The Bardo Thodol invites us to reverse that view, positing that consciousness may be the foundational substrate and that the physical realm is the condensed projection of countless consciousness streams interacting. Death thus liberates consciousness from one layer of projection, potentially revealing deeper truths, unless we create new layers via fear, desire, and attachment. In modern spiritual discourse, people often speak of cosmic consciousness or oneness experiences that echo the text's depiction of merging with the infinite. Some individuals describe near-death experiences or profound spiritual awakenings where they momentarily transcend personal identity and feel enveloped by an all-pervasive love or light. The Bardo Thodol can be seen as a systematic exploration of how to maintain that state of unity beyond fleeting glimpses, guiding us to anchor ourselves in awareness so fully that even death cannot disrupt it. Doing so, it asserts, removes the need for further rebirth, for the illusions that generate the impetus to reincarnate have been recognized at their source. This radical proposition that we can exit the cycle of death and rebirth by recognizing our identity with the clear light might appear lofty or even fantastical. Yet embedded within it is a powerful ethical dimension, the impetus to cultivate compassion, empathy, and selflessness arises naturally once we see that the other is not truly separate from us. If all illusions of separation stem from ignorance, then acts of kindness and altruism are not just moral imperatives. They are logical extensions of a deep recognition that harming another is in some sense harming ourselves. Proponents of the Bardo Thodol frequently point out that the text is not intended to be read in a linear fashion like a conventional book. Rather, it is designed to be used ritually recited at key junctures to trigger awareness in the departed soul. A lama or a knowledgeable practitioner might articulate specific instructions at the moment of death in the days following and during ceremonies that mark the intervals in which consciousness is believed to be most malleable. This practice underscores a central aspect of Tibetan Buddhism, the relationship between teacher and student, and the reliance on oral transmission. Even with the text's wide availability in print, the intangible element of direct guidance, where a teacher tailors instructions to a student's mental state, remains highly valued. As the text made its way into Western contexts, many realized that replicating this ritual usage was challenging. Cultural differences in attitudes toward death, the absence of qualified lamas, and the skepticism around non-empirical claims presented substantial barriers. Nonetheless, a hybrid approach has emerged in some circles, blending the text's content with Western psycho-spiritual support systems. Therapists, chaplains, and hospice workers occasionally reference the Bardo Thodol as an inspirational framework, adapting its guidance to settings where explicit Buddhist rituals might not be feasible. The essential message remains: we can speak to the dying, encourage calm and clarity, and remind them that overwhelming experiences or illusions need not be feared. Another dimension to consider is the text's counsel on how the living can assist the dead beyond reading the teachings. For example, it often recommends that relatives and friends maintain a peaceful environment, avoid frantic emotional outbursts, and focus on positive aspirations for the departed. The logic is straightforward if consciousness is highly susceptible to influences during the bardo. Then a calm and loving atmosphere can provide a helpful context. In contrast, chaotic grief or discord can exacerbate the confusion that the newly departed might experience, inadvertently fueling more disturbing illusions. Various Buddhist communities also advocate for specific periods of time, sometimes up to 49 days, during which prayers and offerings are dedicated to the deceased. This timeline aligns with certain textual interpretations suggesting that the bardo states can last up to 7 weeks before rebirth is definitively sealed. Although such a time frame cannot be verified scientifically, the acts of prayer and remembrance foster communal support, reinforcing the notion that the soul's journey is not undertaken in isolation, but with the energetic backing of loved ones. Even from a purely psychological vantage point, these communal rituals can mitigate the grief of survivors, providing structure and a sense of shared purpose in a time of emotional upheaval. In essence, the Bardo Thodol extends beyond its role as a post-mortem guide. It acts as a cultural touchstone that shapes attitudes toward dying, community support, and spiritual continuity. Whether one practices within a Tibetan lineage or simply draws on its universal themes, the text offers a blueprint for approaching death as a sacred transition, rather than an abrupt annihilation or a taboo subject to be quietly ignored. It is also revealing to note that certain passages of the Bardo Thodol address not only the deceased, but the living who remain. The text consistently reminds us that we are in many ways already in a bardo of day-to-day existence, caught between birth and death. This viewpoint implies that life itself is a transitional state, fleeting, contingent, and shaped by an interplay of karmic conditions. When we grasp the impermanence of our current life bardo, we might approach our days with the same urgency and reverence the text prescribes for the post-death states. We become more sensitive to how illusions can dominate us, such as illusions of permanence, of unchangeable identity, and of the absolute value of external possessions. By recognizing these illusions while alive, we reduce the shock that awaits us when the final illusions of bodily existence dissolve. In many ways, the text's instructions are reminiscent of how a lucid dreamer navigates the dream world. The dreamer maintains a thread of awareness, acknowledging the dream's fabricated nature while still participating in it. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the dream is life, but it extends seamlessly into death. The refusal to wake up, whether in life or after death, sustains the illusions that entangle us. This continuity suggests an unbroken thread of consciousness where the boundaries we label as birth and death are less significant than our capacity to remain aware through transformations. Yet the text does not necessarily propose a nihilistic or escapist worldview. It does not counsel us to discard relationships, responsibilities, and joys, but rather to engage with them without the ignorance that leads to clinging. If one can love without attaching act, without craving for results, and live without identifying too strongly with the transient body, then one can die without suffering the confusions that plague the untrained mind. This is a tall order, to be sure. But Tibetan teachings provide numerous methods from simple breathing exercises to deep analytical meditations on impermanence that gradually cultivate this mental equilibrium. On a more philosophical note, the Bardo Thodol resonates with the idea that we are what we repeatedly do, as Aristotle famously put it. Our habits, mental, emotional, and behavioral, do not vanish at the threshold of death. Instead, they intensify, forging the experiences of the bardo. If we have repeatedly practiced compassion, humility, and insight, these qualities become the scaffolding that holds us steady amid turbulent illusions. If we have consistently indulged in rage, greed, or delusion, that scaffolding crumbles and the illusions feed on our negative energies. Thus, living with the knowledge of the bardos is a powerful motivator to refine our actions and attitudes. Each moment becomes an opportunity to rehearse how we will respond when the illusions of bodily life give way to the illusions of the afterlife. This perspective reframes death as both teacher and test, urging us not to wait until the final moment to discover whether we are prepared. The text's constant refrain is that the wise practitioner treats every day as a stepping stone toward the ultimate transition, weaving daily life and the inevitability of death into one seamless tapestry of mindful existence. Contemplating the Bardo Thodol, it becomes clear why it has been called both a guide for the dead and a guide for the living. To the living, it offers a mirror. Look, this is what your mind may do when unanchored by the body, so learn to steady it now. To the dead, it whispers. These terrifying or blissful forms are your own projections. Recognize them and be free. In bridging life and death so seamlessly, the text highlights a continuum of awareness, refusing to isolate the phenomenon of dying as a final disjunction from existence. In practical application, individuals who integrate these teachings into their daily routines might set aside time each morning or evening to reflect on mortality. This reflection is not meant to be morbid, but to generate a sense of immediacy and gratitude for the present moment. That sense of gratitude, ironically, can lead to greater zest for life. One recognizes that each breath is a gift, fleeting and precious, and that each interaction with others is an opportunity to practice kindness or clarity. Over time, such a mindset can diffuse many of the anxieties that otherwise accumulate when death remains an unacknowledged terror. Moreover, the Bardo Thodol's portrayal of illusions after death can offer a broader lens through which to view grief. When a loved one passes away, those left behind are themselves thrust into a bardo of change, an in-between state where the old normal no longer exists and a new normal has yet to form. Recognizing this can encourage a more compassionate approach to mourning, seeing it as a transitional process that mirrors the journeys described in the text. Friends and relatives might find solace in performing rituals or prayers that resonate with the teachings, not necessarily to save the departed from external judgment, but to provide a peaceful mental environment that can ease their confusion. In contemporary spiritual discourse, the Bardo Thodol often finds echoes in the concept of conscious dying, a movement that advocates for emotional, psychological, and spiritual preparation for death. People construct death plans similar to birth plans, specifying their wishes for the atmosphere in their final hours, the presence of certain spiritual advisors, or the recitations of specific verses. By reclaiming the sacredness of dying, this movement challenges the industrialized medical model where death is frequently hidden behind hospital curtains, turning it instead into an occasion for introspection and potentially for deep transformation. Ultimately, the text invites us to hold two truths. Simultaneously, life is precious and death is inevitable. Rather than see these as contradictory, the Bardo Thodol uses the inevitability of death as a galvanizing force that renders life more meaningful. In urging us to prepare for death, it teaches us to live more fully, less entangled in petty squabbles, less obsessed with material acquisition, and more in tune with the vast potential of our consciousness. It suggests that by embracing the transience of our current form, we can discover a deeper, unchanging reality that transcends the illusions we once mistook for absolute truth. As modern readers engage with the Bardo Thodol, a recurring question is, what if this is correct? What if everything we assume about death as a mere cessation of being is only a partial story? The text doesn't demand blind acceptance of its claims. Rather, it encourages exploration. Through meditation, mindfulness, and ethical living, anyone can gather experiential evidence of how illusions form and dissipate in the mind. If illusions can so convincingly appear in waking life and in dreams, is it truly so far-fetched that they can persist when the body is no longer alive? Contemplating the text's teachings often stirs a range of emotional responses. Some feel relief at the notion that consciousness does not simply vanish. Others experience dread, realizing that if our illusions continue, we cannot escape them simply by dying. Yet the Bardo Thodol offers hope through empowerment. Illusions can be transcended if recognized. The power to recognize them hinges on the awareness we develop here and now. That awareness is like a lantern we carry into the dark unknown. If the lantern is bright, we see illusions for what they are. If it's dim, we stumble and mistake shadows for reality. Moreover, the text's take on heaven and hell as projections resonates with many who find mainstream religious doctrines of eternal damnation or everlasting paradise too rigid or morally simplistic. Instead, the Bardo Thodol posits a dynamic interplay in which we hold responsibility for shaping our experiences, both in life and after death. This stance liberates us from fatalism, instilling the confidence that personal spiritual effort genuinely matters. Our daily thoughts, emotions, and deeds incrementally sculpt the karmic landscape that will greet us when we step beyond the physical plane. For those who have witnessed the death of loved ones, the text also provides a framework for processing their own grief. They might recast certain final gestures or statements from the dying as clues of an emerging bardo perception. Alternatively, they can pour their love into rituals designed to calm and guide the departed's consciousness, translating sorrow into purposeful support. While this might not erase the pain of loss, it can imbue the bereavement period with a sense of spiritual continuity and shared compassionate intention. Culturally, the Bardo Thodol has prompted a re-evaluation of how we approach funerals, memorials, and the conversation around death and dying. Whether or not one adopts the text's full metaphysical framework, the idea that we should meet death with dignity, composure, and a supportive community resonates widely. In that sense, the text's influence now stretches far beyond Himalayan monasteries. It finds a place in the hearts of anyone seeking a more conscious, holistic approach to the end of life, proving that its scope is not confined to the medieval Tibetan landscape, but extends to the broad tapestry of human inquiry into what lies beyond the final breath. In closing, the Bardo Thodol invites each of us to contemplate a question that has haunted humanity across epochs. What really happens when we die? Far from offering a simplistic solution, it presents a nuanced narrative that implicates our every thought, intention, and emotion in the shaping of post-death experiences. Rather than a singular heaven or hell decreed by a distant power, we encounter a spectrum of possibilities reflecting the mind's contents. While the text is rooted in Tibetan Buddhist cosmology, its psychological insights and practical directives resonate universally. It teaches that what we call death is not the abrupt annihilation of awareness, but a threshold to be consciously navigated if and only if we train ourselves to meet it with clear perception and open acceptance. At the heart of its teaching is the recognition that illusions are not external punitive constructs, but internal reflections of our own unresolved mental states. Wrathful deities mirror our unacknowledged anger and terror. Peaceful deities echo our innate compassion and wisdom. Karmic forces channel the momentum we've accumulated over countless moments of life. For those who can remain steady in the face of such revelations, liberation becomes possible. Liberation in this context means transcending the cyclical dance of birth and death by realizing the non-dual nature of consciousness. It is an awakening to the truth that the radiant light we fear or chase is actually within us, indistinguishable from our core essence. Yet the text does not sugarcoat the challenge. Most of us, it suggests, will not achieve full recognition on our first post-mortem attempt. We will recoil in fear or reach out in clinging, and thus we will swirl back into samsara for another round of learning. Still, this cyclical process is neither cruel nor futile. It is, in the Buddhist sense, an ongoing opportunity to refine our awareness. Each incarnation offers us a renewed chance to practice compassion, mindfulness, and the art of seeing through illusions. The Bardo Thodol thus stands as a masterclass, in continuity, urging us to realize that the boundaries we draw between life and death, between self and other, are themselves illusions forged by the mind. Ultimately, the real crux lies in whether we take these teachings to heart, using them as a catalyst for tangible shifts in how we live. Do we carry on pretending life is permanent, storing up regrets and attachments? Or do we bring a Bardo awareness into everyday, recognizing that each breath is an encounter with impermanence? In the final analysis, the text places the responsibility for awakening firmly upon us, not in a sense of moral judgment, but as an invitation to explore our true nature. Perhaps that is why it remains as compelling now as it was centuries ago. By presenting death not as the end, but as a revelatory passage shaped by our own minds, the Bardo Thodol reminds us that the greatest transformations begin from within here in the midst of life, as we prepare for the ultimate journey that awaits us all. Reflecting on the journey we've just explored together, I can't help but feel inspired not only about the mysteries that await us after death, but about the powerful lessons this ancient wisdom holds for our everyday lives. The true message here isn't about dying. It's about learning how to fully live unburdened by fear or regret. By understanding what awaits us beyond life's final moments, we gain a deeper appreciation for every breath, every choice, and every connection we make today. From my own perspective, recognizing life's impermanence encourages a remarkable sense of freedom, compassion, and purpose. It's not about waiting for the afterlife. It's about embracing life's potential right here and now. But enough from me. I want to hear from you. What did this journey stir within you? Did it inspire hope, curiosity, or perhaps skepticism? Please leave your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I'd love to continue this fascinating conversation with you. Don't forget to subscribe, stay connected, and join us again soon for more enriching stories and life-changing wisdom.